We've been doing this series in July based on the Declaration of Independence, focusing on some of the Enlightenment ideals that we find in the Declaration, and we've been looking at it through the lens of a recent book called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress by Steven Pinker. Now, I mentioned last week that the Declaration is itself a product of the Enlightenment. The drafters of the Declaration of Independence were steeped in Enlightenment philosophy and ideals, but it was also a declaration of human rights, probably the first of its kind in modern times. And this is the paragraph that we've been working with here. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Seems to be a clear, unequivocal, unconditional statement, but we know that it took a long time before those ideals were applied to all human beings equally. And it wasn't because the founders were evil or stupid. The problem is that they were human, and they were subject to certain flaws in the way that they think, just like everyone else back then and now. Why does that happen? Why is that? It's an important question. It's so important that the founders of two of the world's major religions made it a cornerstone of their teaching, getting at the reasons why human beings have these flaws in the way that they think. Earlier this year, we did a series based on this book here called Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. He takes a look at Buddhist teachings from the perspective of modern psychology and neuroscience, and this is how he describes one of the Buddha's core teachings. He says, "The reason we suffer and the reason we make other people suffer is that we don't see the world clearly. At the heart of the Buddhist meditative practice is a radical promise. We can learn to see the world, including ourselves, more clearly, and so gain a deep and morally valid happiness." There's that word happiness again. Another one of the key ideas in the Declaration of Independence that we talked about earlier this month, I find these connections to be fascinating. It's almost as if we're seeing a convergence happening, and it's all because we're just now arriving at a deeper understanding of human consciousness that is allowing us to actually advance the work of our ancient spiritual teachers. We don't see the world clearly because we're all subject to various forms of what they call cognitive bias, which in plain English means faulty thinking, or if we want to use Unity speak, we could call it error thinking. You see, our co-founder in Unity, Charles Fillmore, was on the bandwagon as well, but we have to remember that he too lived at a time when we knew very little about human psychology and neuroscience. We have to be engaged in this constant process of updating our teachings, updating our knowledge base. And I know how annoying that can be. Nothing worse than needing to get to work on something. I open up my laptop and I get this message. Configuring update, do not turn off your computer. Well, of course, I'm not going to turn it off because I just turned it on because I wanted to get some work done, right? You know, productivity, that's what it's supposed to be all about. And of course, we know how those updates work, right? They always, welcome to Windows Update, where it will take an hour to get to 30% and 10 minutes to finish the rest or whatever, you know. Isn't that how it works? And please, no smug comments from the Mac users out there. Apple has its own issues. The point is that the update process is necessary, but it's not always convenient. We're not always going to like it. Our own operating system at the level of consciousness needs to be updated as well, and it isn't always convenient or comfortable either, especially when that update points out a way of thinking that no longer works or brings us face to face with one of those cognitive biases or some form of error thinking that we've been prone to. It no longer works, but it's comfortable. It's familiar, so much so that we want to defend it even in the face of the evidence which tells us it no longer serves us. Such is the human condition. Now, the founder of one of the other major world religions was also aware of the need for us to come to terms with our cognitive bias, and last week we left off with this verse from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is reported as saying, "And why worry about the speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying, 'Friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye,' when you can't see past the log in your own eye?" Cognitive bias. Jesus had a pretty deep understanding of the human condition. He knew how difficult it was for people to stop complaining about other people, to stop engaging in fault finding, and trying to fix people. Finding fault and trying to fix people. The problem with fault finding and fixing is because when we finally learn that we can't fix people, well, the next thing we do then is we marginalize them. We ignore them. And Jesus knew how difficult it was for people to stop marginalizing those they couldn't fix or force to change. He knew about this tendency that we have to distance ourselves from people that we judge as being faulty or in need of fixing. He knew that this cycle of fault finding, fixing, and separation was causing major damage to all of our relationships, really, and consequently it was damaging to our ability to create a peaceful and sustainable future for humankind. That's how important it is. And 2,000 and some odd years later, we're still working on it. The authors of the Declaration of Independence had to work on it, but we're learning. We're learning. You know, Jesus and the Buddha in their time was a bit more evolved than the other people around them. And maybe now it looks like we're starting to catch up. Maybe we're starting to be able to validate what they were teaching based on what we've learned about human psychology and neuroscience. We're able to validate it and add our own knowledge and discoveries to the mix. That's why this is such an exciting time to be alive. You know, we talk in Unity about how human consciousness is evolving. We talk about intelligence in new ways. We use terms now like emotional and spiritual intelligence, things that we weren't even thinking about 50 years ago. You know, one of the most beneficial things about an evolutionary process like this is that it has brought us to the point now where just now we're beginning to be able to take multiple perspectives. At this point in human history, we're finally better able to see and to appreciate the experiences and worldviews of other people and cultures. That's because we've been brought together in ways that we have never dreamed possible. They say the world is shrinking, yep, and we're rubbing elbows with these people. We have to come to terms with it, and we want to do it in a way that's going to lead to thriving rather than more strife. So we're learning. It's a major change for the better. And I think it's what Jesus was getting at when he suggested that we stop being so obsessed with pointing out the errors and faults of others and instead first take a look at our own stuff. You know, there's a quote that I like to use from Unity author Eric Butterworth. He says, "We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are." Or we see the world as it is in our immediate vicinity. Our worldview then shapes our experience, and if we want to live consciously and intentionally, we need to examine our view and get a deeper understanding. That's why we emphasize this thing we call self-awareness. Not selfish awareness, but self-awareness, being honest with ourselves about our worldview, about how it affects the way we interpret reality. Do we think that this is a friendly or a hostile universe? Is this a world of scarcity or a world of abundance? Do we think that being different is dangerous? How many times do we marginalize and distance ourselves from people because they're different, which we interpret as dangerous or risky? And we can get really good at rationalizing our negative and judgmental worldviews. Back in 2011, we did a fall series. We were working with this book here by Robert Brummett called Birthing a Greater Reality. And he talks about this aspect of our evolution of consciousness. And he used this, this ancient Hindu story, the one about 6 people wearing blindfolds who were examining an elephant. You know, it's a well-worn story. It's an old, familiar story, but I think it's still very instructive. Here's what it looks like. They all got their blindfolds on. They're each examining a different part of this big elephant, and they each get a different idea about what they're perceiving. So the one who's grabbing the ear says it's a fan, the tusk is a spear, the trunk is a snake, the leg is a tree trunk, the tail is a rope, and the one on the side of the elephant says that it's a wall, okay? And I just love the look on the elephant's face there. Can you kind of make that out? You know what the elephant is thinking. That judgmental elephant, he's saying, bunch of idiots, right? Bunch of idiots. So, that's not the end of the story, because later on, what the story doesn't tell you about is that they all have to get together and discuss what they think this thing that they're examining really is. And that's where the fun starts, right? What is the reality based on these different experiences, these different perspectives? Well, if they're operating at the former, less evolved level of thinking, level of consciousness, they get into a big argument because each one only had part of the picture, and each one thinks that their part of the picture is the whole reality, and the other versions are wrong, or perhaps even dangerous. Nope, you're wrong. In fact, there must be something wrong with you because you don't see things the same way that I do, so I'll either have to get you to change the way you think or ignore you if I can't make you change. Either that or I'll call you a socialist. You know, I mean, that's how it devolves. Now we shift to the next level. And operating at the emerging level of consciousness, where people become aware of their cognitive bias, of the limitations perhaps of their own experience, they find a way to take all these multiple perspectives and they put them into a complete picture where they are finally seeing the reality that it's an elephant. Out of this emerges the greater and more accurate picture of reality. Nobody was wrong. It's just that everybody had only a piece of the truth, which they misinterpreted because they were still operating under the judgmental and confrontational level of consciousness that sees different as dangerous and insists that my little perspective is the only valid one. Operating at that level, they would have lost the greater reality, the greater truth, because it never emerged. You know, it makes me wonder sometimes what humankind might have lost over the centuries because we couldn't rise above that old way of thinking sooner. And I also think about what might be the price that we're going to have to pay if we don't learn how to do that now, how to get better at it. You know, Jesus and the Buddha, they weren't just mouthing a bunch of pious platitudes, a bunch of feel-good stuff here. They're telling us about something that really has important ramifications for our future if we're willing to look at it. Diverse ideas, opposing worldviews are essential to the process of evolution. That's how it works. The reason that there is something instead of nothing, the reason that there is a universe instead of oblivion is because diversity and polarity coexist. Negative, positive, hot, cold, light, dark, and so on. You know, a great practical example of how evolutionary polarity and diversity works in leadership is Abraham Lincoln. He learned how to appreciate and welcome multiple and conflicting perspectives. You all might remember that movie back in 2012 that came out called Lincoln. Great movie, based on a book called Team of Rivals, which tells how Lincoln chose to deliberately surround himself with people who disagreed with him. He surrounded himself with people who held worldviews that conflicted with his own. In fact, he had such a contentious bunch in his cabinet that during meetings they would call each other liars, traitors, thieves, things like that. Now he didn't have to do that. You know, he could have appointed a bunch of yes men, but he didn't. And the author of the book said this about Lincoln. She said, Lincoln's political genius was rooted in his remarkable array of emotional strengths, which enabled him to form friendships with rivals who had previously disdained him, to put past grudges aside, to assume responsibility for the failure of subordinates, to share credit with ease and learn from mistakes. She uses that word genius. And in the book Enlightenment Now, Steven Pinker also calls this a form of genius as well. He says, no one is brilliant enough to dream up anything of value all by himself. Individuals and cultures of genius are aggregators, appropriators, greatest hit collectors. Vibrant cultures sit in vast catchment areas in which people and innovations flow from far and wide. That's the level of consciousness that it took to put an end to slavery and preserve the Union at the same time. That's what can be accomplished when we learn to stop worrying about that speck in our neighbor's eye and instead start focusing on expanding our own vision and inviting those with different ideas into our circles of caring and compassion. So it sounds like Jesus and the Buddha were onto something back then, but it's up to us to install the updates. See you next week and we'll wrap things up.